Hello, I am Erich Ludendorff, and I would like to share my story with you. I was born on April 9, 1865, in Grusenia, a village in eastern Prussia, which is now part of modern-day Poland. My mother, Clara, was of noble Polish descent, and my father, August Ludendorff, was a member of the Prussian Junker or nobility, who historically formed the backbone of the Prussian civil service and officer classes. I was one of 6 children who grew up on our family farm, where we were given a basic education by our mother and her extended family. In school, I outshone all those around me, but my academic brilliance was in large part due to my being a loner. I refused to play with my classmates through fear they would dirty my shoes, and instead preferred to study or read. However, my superb academic performance eventually paid dividends, as I was accepted into a prestigious military academy in northern Germany after leaving school. I consistently outshone my fellow students as my education progressed. Indeed, according to accounts, I was a strange character and seemed to have been a workaholic with few, if any, friends. I often isolated myself from my colleagues and family members, much preferring to work alone. In many ways, this insular character would prove to be one of my greatest strengths and weaknesses over the coming years. I had an immense capacity for work, but on the other hand, I seldom listened to advice from my colleagues, and my lack of openness would eventually have a detrimental effect on my health. I then graduated as a junior officer in 1895 and was steadily promoted over the coming years until I was recommended to the General Staff of the German Army in 1894. Later, in 1904, I was promoted to the Great General Staff in Berlin. It was during this period that I fell for a married woman named Margrethe Schmidt, whom I had met during a rainstorm and offered my umbrella. The two of us soon fell for one another, resulting in Margrethe divorcing her husband and marrying me instead. At the time, she already had 3 sons and 1 daughter from her first marriage, to whom I became a devoted stepfather. The respective families soon accepted our union due to my evident affection for them. By 1906, I was a senior officer in the German General Staff, which was headed by one of the most important military figures of the turn of the century, Alfred von Schlieffen, whose strategic planning in the decades before World War I would shape the early stages of the conflict. Schlieffen is famous today in military circles due to his grand strategy for a possible war with France and Russia, which is known as the Schlieffen Plan. The details of this plan were essentially to knock France out of the war quickly by delivering a massive knockout blow in the shape of a large-scale advance through Belgium and Holland, which would then surround Paris from the north and then attack the French armies in the rear, who hopefully would still be pinned down by diversionary attacks in eastern France. Germany then hoped to turn all of its might against the Russians, who, it was assumed, would only be able to mobilize their armies slowly due to the long distances they would have to travel and relatively primitive Russian rail and road networks. The reason for this plan being formed in the first place was that tension had been festering for some 30 years between France and Germany since the Franco-Prussian War, in which the Germans had crushed the French in a matter of weeks and occupied the border regions of eastern France. As Germany, we formed a secret alliance with Austria against Russia in 1879, and Italy later joined in 1882, which only added to our list of potential enemies. In response, France and Russia formed their own alliance in 1891, and our growing naval power in the early 1900s prompted Great Britain to join them. By 1910, we, along with Austria, Hungary and Italy, were surrounded, meaning that we would have to potentially fight simultaneously against Russia, France and Britain if war broke out. To prepare for this possibility, we formed the plan, which aimed to quickly defeat either the French or the Russians in order to concentrate our forces on as few fighting fronts as possible. The alliances between the major powers effectively bound us all together, and it only took a spark to ignite a massive European war. That spark came on June 28, 1914, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo by a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip. As the colonel and member of the German General Staff, I was responsible for distributing orders for the Schlieffen Plan to various units of the German army. I even visited fortresses such as Liège in Belgium to report on the state of the country's defences. However, the implementation of the planned invasion of Belgium was hampered in 1912 when the centre-left Social Democratic Party of Germany won a majority in the Reichstag and refused to sanction more defence spending. I believe that more infantry divisions were necessary to carry out the plan and took the controversial step of lobbying the German parliament for an increase in the size of the army. My efforts were eventually rewarded with increased military spending, but they also cost me my position in the General Staff, and I was subsequently demoted to command the 39th Fusiliers in the lead-up to the war. When Austria delivered an ultimatum to the Royal Serbian government on July 23, 1914, and declared war despite any possible Russian intervention, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia mobilized his armies on the Austrian frontier to support the Serbs. This sparked a chain reaction of mobilization across the continent, and within a matter of weeks, Germany and Austria were at war against France, Russia, and Britain. I was appointed as the Deputy Chief of Staff to the German Second Army after the start of the war. Our mission was to advance through Belgium via Lies and then on into northern France. I was appointed due to my previous visit to Liège and its defences. When the German assault on the city started in August of 14, I was there as an observer. However, during the initial finding, the commander of the 14th Brigade was killed, and I stepped in and oversaw the successful capture of the city. In one famous instance, I even walked alone up to the city's citadel, which was offering particularly stubborn resistance, knocked on the gates, and politely demanded the surrender of its defenders. They agreed, and shortly afterward, all the forts in Liège fell to us, meaning we could now advance west towards the French border. I was hailed as a hero after the capture of the city, and was given Germany's highest honour for bravery, the Pour l'Émérite, by Kaiser Wilhelm on August 22. However, the jubilation was soon cut short by the news that Russia had mobilized its armies sooner than expected and invaded eastern Prussia. The Schlieffen Plan had only allocated a single army, the 8th, to defend Germany's eastern frontier, as it assumed the Russian armies would only be able to mobilize slowly. Therefore, the news that the Tsar's armies had mobilized in strength and were advancing into Germany's eastern territories was potentially disastrous, to say the least. It was now clear that I was an extremely capable organizer and strategist, and also that I was wasted in the field. Therefore, the German High Command appointed me as Chief of Staff of the 8th Army under a formerly retired general named Paul von Hindenburg. Hindenburg, although in his 60s, was chosen to command the 8th Army not only due to his experience, but also because he radiated calmness and composure, which was in short supply in the east, as the army's former commanders had panicked in the face of the Russian onslaught, which had nearly resulted in a full-scale rout. When we first met on the train that was to carry us east, we quickly established a rapport. The German railway network was cleared of all obstacles to allow us to travel as speedily as possible. The two of us were a perfect match. Hindenburg's cool, calm authority complemented my workaholic nature. We arrived at the 8th Army headquarters and quickly set about putting things in order to steady the front, despite the Germans being heavily outnumbered. After familiarizing myself with the military situation, I noticed that the two Russian armies that were invading eastern Prussia had become separated, and I saw an opportunity to potentially crush one and then turn on the other. In the resulting battle named Tannenberg, my plan proved to be an amazing success, and within 4 days, an entire Russian Second Army had been surrounded and annihilated, prompting its commander, Alexander Samsonov, to walk into a wood and shoot himself. Hindenburg was hailed as a hero after the victory, even though the plan to attack had been mine. But the triumph of Tannenberg was a priceless propaganda coup for us, who are now starting to get bogged down on the Western Front. I can say that our success in the first 2 years of the war resulted in the eventual collapse of the Eastern Front, despite the Schlieffen Plan stipulating that we should attack the Western Allies first. My colleague and I were able to inflict numerous defeats on the Russians between 1914 and 1916, such as in the battles of the Masurian Lakes and the Galicianov offensive. However, our progress was limited by the small number of troops we had been assigned and the constant failures of our Austro-Hungarian allies in the south. By 1915, it became clear that the Schlieffen Plan had effectively failed due to the need for speed, which we could not achieve with the limited transportation technology of the time. Despite this, the German army had to march on foot through enemy territory, making our plan of a lightning attack highly optimistic. Additionally, the First World War was a conflict where new technologies and tactics were met and superseded by old ones. The advent of machine guns and heavy artillery made traditional tactics of advancing in lines redundant, resulting in opposing armies constructing mirrored networks of trenches that spread across hundreds of miles. As a result, both sides were confronted with unprecedented enemy defense networks consisting of millions of mines, hundreds of thousands of miles of barbed wire, tens of thousands of machine gun nests, and the constant threat of artillery bombardment. This made warfare much deadlier and required us to take cover in dugouts or trenches to have any hope of survival against the barrage of machine gun bullets and shells dominating the battlefield. In conclusion, the First World War was a turning point in warfare history that changed the way we fought wars forever. As a military commander during World War, I recall the constant pressure to defeat the enemy from both military and civilian superiors. Unfortunately, our lack of experience in entrenched warfare on such a massive scale often led to sending tens of thousands of troops against enemy defenses in the desperate hope of claiming victories. Today, many view the strategies and tactics used in the early stages of trench warfare on the Western Front negatively. However, it's essential to remember that the military situation in 1915 was unprecedented, and a process of trial and error was inevitable in trying to find a way to break through the deadlock. This resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths on both sides. As a result, large-scale infantry offensives against entrenched enemy positions became a regular pattern in the middle to late period of the war. In 1916, as the chief of the German General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn devised a plan to attack the French in a massive assault against the fortress city of Verdun in eastern France. The battle, named Verdun, would last from February to December 1916 and was the largest and longest battle of the entire First World War. For the assault, the Germans amassed some 50 divisions, along with 1,200 of our dreaded heavy howitzers, and attacked the French defences in the central to southern section of the Western Front, around Verdun. Initially, all seemed to go according to plan, but the French, knowing full well that a German victory could end the war, threw everything they had at the front's defences, resulting in a months-long slugging match and unprecedented carnage on both sides. Our intention in attacking the French had been to bleed the country's manpower white, but in reality our losses were just as heavy as our enemies. To relieve the pressure, the French appealed to the British, who were holding the northern section of the Allied line, to launch a combined offensive to relieve the strain in the south. They agreed, and the result was the Battle of the Somme. By the end of the year, the Allies had pushed us back by a mere matter of miles, and we had lost hundreds of thousands of men, dead, wounded, and captured in the process. However, by the end of 1916, the front had been stabilized for the Allies, and we had lost well over 1 million men in 11 months. Falkenhayn was sacked by Kaiser Wilhelm, who replaced him with the heroes of the Eastern Front, Paul von Hindenburg, as Chief of Staff, and myself as the first Quartermaster General under him. We were both fierce critics of Falkenhayn's failures over the preceding months, and were now tasked with trying to win the war for Germany before its limited manpower and resources were worn down. It's also important to remember that although Germany had a parliament in the Reichstag during World War, it was not nearly as powerful as its British equivalent. Instead, the real power in the country lay in the hands of the Kaiser. However, as the war progressed, the German High Command and the military gradually took control over virtually every aspect of government. By the later stages of the conflict, it was effectively a military dictatorship with me at the head in all but name. I knew that the Kaiser had his doubts about appointing us. In particular, he didn't like me, Erich Ludendorff, believing that I was nothing more than a glorified sergeant major. However, the German losses in 1916 had weakened Wilhelm's authority as monarch, and he had to act quickly. He hoped that Hindenburg and I could turn the tide of the war in Germany's favour. As a result, I became the most powerful man in Germany, as Hindenburg was less hands-on than me. The burden of leading Germany to victory now fell on my shoulders, as I was the strategic brain and logistical mastermind behind our partnership. One of our first decisions in 1917 was to increase German U-boat operations in the North Atlantic and the sea surrounding Britain. Hindenburg had advised the Kaiser that the war must end as soon as possible by whatever means necessary, as there was no breakthrough in sight on the Western Front. We believed that attacking Allied shipping could be a possible solution. Unrestricted submarine warfare was initially successful, sinking 3 million tons of Allied shipping between February and June of 1917, with the loss of only 9 U-boats. This caused a near crisis in Britain, as the country had only 6 weeks of supplies left in the spring of 1917. If things got worse, Britain could potentially be forced to sue for peace. However, sinking large amounts of transatlantic shipping meant that neutral merchant vessels, especially American ships, were often sent to the bottom of the ocean. The sinking of the arms Lusitania in May of 1915 had already caused tension between Germany and the United States, and incidents involving American shipping and civilians continued. Eventually, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, severed all diplomatic ties with Germany, and the United States Congress voted to declare war. This was a significant blow for Germany, as the world's richest country and largest economy had joined the Allies, providing them with fresh supplies, war materials, and massive manpower. The German High Command could have tried to enter peace negotiations, but I was determined to carry on fighting. I believed that if the war ended without Germany making territorial gains, the Allies would be victorious. So we had to try to defeat the British and the French on the Western Front as soon as possible. I believed that my determination to continue the fight was based on a correct calculation that it would take time for the Americans to enter the war. From the German perspective, the most significant event was the collapse of the Russian Empire due to the country's economy being gradually worn down since the start of the war, leading to widespread unrest in the civilian population and the army. The revolution in February 1917 eventually boiled over into a full-scale revolution, and Tsar Nicholas was deposed a month later. However, the revolution was overturned in October of 1917 when the Bolsheviks seized power and entered into peace negotiations with Germany, which concluded in March of 1918. This freed up hundreds of thousands of German troops from the Western Front and High Command, allowing preparations to be made to hold them at the Western Allies. It was argued that this surge in manpower could have been used to secure a peace agreement from the Allies, but the decision was taken to gamble Germany's last reserves of troops in the hope of defeating the Allies. As the main instigator of the forthcoming attack, I oversaw the plans of the onslaught. I was not content to simply send my fresh troops into battle, but took the opportunity to overhaul my forces by creating new elite assault divisions comprised of stormtroopers armed with weapons such as flamethrowers and light machine guns. These troops would spearhead the German attack and be followed by the main body of the German infantry, who would consolidate and hold its territorial gains in case of Allied counterattacks. I oversaw practically every aspect of the coming offensive in the hope of reducing the chances of its failure. The pressure that was now on me was immense, as the failure of this offensive would surely spell doom for Germany's hopes of winning the war. My plan, named Kaiserschlacht, or the Kaiser's Battle, was to drive a wedge between the British and French armies in northern France and then advance towards the Channel ports to cut off the British supply lines and push them into the sea. The attack then came on the 21 March 1918 on a 100-mile front in northern France, between the area around the River Somme in the north to the city of Reims in the south. I seldom ventured outside my headquarters during the fighting and had little or no conception of the conditions my troops were enduring. At one point I stated that the nature of war was to consume men. In essence, I was the epitome of a staff officer, more used to maps, dispatches and meetings than frontline command, and lived throughout the war in relatively luxurious surroundings. Throughout my entire career, I had seldom bothered to interest myself in the day-to-day lives of those under me and much preferred to spend endless hours working at my headquarters, only taking breaks to eat or sleep. In March 1918, I left the luxury of my headquarters and was driven through the devastation of the old Somme battlefield to a roadside where I was met by several German soldiers. They then led me to 2 graves marked with the customary makeshift crosses, upon one of which read the words, "Here lies 2 German flying officers." The covering from one of the bodies was then pulled away, revealing the heavily decomposed face of one of my beloved stepsons, Erich I had already lost another of my stepsons a year before, but being confronted with the stark reality of war in all its maggot-ridden putrid detail seemingly had a massive effect on me. I stood over the corpse doing my best not to sob, but in the distance the crack of shellfire was a constant reminder that my massive offensive was in full swing. Perhaps now I had realized, at least subconsciously, that the decisions I had made in the comfortable surroundings of my headquarters often resulted in the untimely deaths of hundreds of thousands of young men whose bodies would often end up rotting in French fields. Meanwhile, far away to the west, on the 26th of March, at a panic-ridden meeting, the Allied commanders decided to make a last stand in the hope of halting the German advance. It was now literally do or die for both sides, as the following confrontations up and down the line would, in effect, decide the outcome of the entire war. However, as each day passed, the progress of our armies became less and less as the further we went westwards, the longer our supply lines and the greater our casualties became. All this combined soon resulted by July 1918 in our attacks simply fizzling out, meaning that I had lost nearly 750,000 German troops who were killed, wounded or captured in return for another strategic failure. The Allies, in turn, now bolstered by fresh American divisions, counterattacked in August of 1918 and steadily reversed all the German gains that had been won at such a high cost only months before. During these months, the gravity of the situation began to dawn on the German High Command, but I still refused to accept defeat, not wanting to contemplate what may lay ahead. However, discontent was now also on the rise in Germany itself, as food prices were now sky-high because of the failed harvests and the Allied trade blockade. German troops were also starting to retreat or surrender in their droves. And after hearing the reports of mass surrenders, I began to accept that the German war machine was all but spent. I would also spend hours brooding at the graveside of my stepson Erich, who had been unable to send home to his wife and was clearly showing signs of mental illness. Concerned by my behavior, my staff then called a psychiatrist who advised me to rest, which I agreed to, resulting in me spending a month away on leave. I then returned to headquarters, refreshed at least to start with, but was soon thrown back into the deep end by the news of the relentless Allied advances. On the 28th of September 1918, the news came that one of Germany's last remaining allies, Bulgaria, had sued for peace, and some accounts stated that after hearing this news, I fell to the floor and had a fit. Whatever the truth, I was now in no fit state to continue in my position, and the following day both Hindenburg and I informed the Kaiser that an armistice should be concluded as soon as possible. I then, despite being a confirmed autocrat, advised the Kaiser that a civilian government should take control of Germany in the hope of obtaining more favourable peace terms. On the surface, this seemed like an innocent idea, but in the coming years I would in part blame Germany's left-leaning politicians for the country's defeat in an effort to divert the blame for Germany's demise away from myself. As a military commander, I demanded a request for peace talks be sent to the American president, Woodrow Wilson, as soon as possible. I had hoped that the Americans would be more lenient with Germany, but Wilson saw Prussian militarism as the cause of the war and demanded the total withdrawal of all German forces from occupied territories and that the Kaiser and his generals surrender power. I rejected Wilson's demands and lobbied for the fighting to continue, but the civilian government formed under the liberal Prince Maximilian Baden ignored me and continued negotiations. Despite the government being formed largely due to my insistence, the peace negotiations were not unfolding as I wished. Seeing that my authority had been reduced, I tendered my resignation on October 26, 1918. However, there was widespread unrest throughout Germany, with numerous far-left groups starting violent incursions, demanding the Kaiser's abdication, which occurred on November 9, 1918. 2 days later, the 4 years of carnage finally came to an end with an armistice. I fled the country to Sweden in disguise, fearing being attacked during the upheaval. While in Sweden, I wrote articles and books blaming the Kaiser and the far left for Germany's defeat to deflect the blame from myself. I returned to Berlin in 1919 and continued to agitate against the leftist government until 1920. I was involved in a failed push or coup in Berlin, instigated by the far right, who hoped to return Germany to autocratic rule. The coup failed, and I fled to Munich, where in 1923 I held a meeting with a former First World War corporal named Adolf Hitler, who was the leader of the obscure National Socialist German Workers' Party. At the meeting, Hitler convinced me to join his beer hall putsch to take control of the Bavarian government. In the putsch, Hitler and his followers took the minister-president of Bavaria, Gustav von Kahr, hostage while he was attending a meeting in the Berger Brokeler Beer Hall in Munich. Hitler initially attempted to browbeat Kahr into backing him, but he refused, and then I arrived, resulting in the gathered crowds and Kahr accepting Hitler's terms. The Führer then left the hall, leaving Kahr in my custody, who I then released after the minister-president complained he was worried about his wife. Hitler was outraged by my stupidity, and the next day the gathered Nazis marched from the Bavarian Defense Ministry, but were blocked by some 150 soldiers who opened fire, killing a number of Nazis in the process. I was arrested at the scene along with Hitler and a number of other men, and we were put on trial from February to April of 1924. At the end of the trial, I was acquitted, but Hitler and some of his followers, including Rudolf Hess, were sent to prison. Over the years that followed, my political views became increasingly obscure and extreme. I wrote endlessly about my hatred of the Jews and Christianity, which I blamed for all the world's ills. For a time, I was an ardent Nazi and visited Hitler several times while he was in prison. However, as time went by, I was sidelined by Hitler, and upon hearing that he had come to power in 1933, I stated that I solemnly prophesied that this accursed man would cast our reach into the abyss and bring our nation to inconceivable misery. I continued to write military textbooks in my final years, but in 1937 I contracted liver cancer and died on December 20th. Against my wishes, the Nazi regime gave me a state funeral. Today, historians largely view me in a negative light. Many see my failures as Quartermaster General of the German Army as being one of the most important factors in Germany's eventual capitulation. Instead of trying to secure peace terms from a position of strength in the winter of 1917 to 1918, I decided to gamble Germany's last reserves of men in order to claim victory. I am also criticized for essentially being an armchair general who cared little for the conditions my troops were living under and seldom venturing outside of my headquarters to see the situation at the front in person. It is also fair to say that I shifted the blame for Germany's defeat in World War I away from myself and instead blamed the country's defeat on radical elements in the German population, such as the Jews and communists. Ironically, the myth of the enemy within that I did more than most to spread eventually resulted in the rise of the nationalist far right in Germany and was in essence the root cause of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party coming to power. Indeed, the ultimate irony is that Hitler, who fell for my claims that the German war effort had been weakened by the enemy within, eventually formed a close friendship with the very man who was more than anyone responsible for Germany's humiliating defeat. For these reasons, it is difficult to say that my life and career had anything but a negative effect on both German and European history, as the total defeat I did so much to bring about, and my support of the Nazi Party helped to instigate the Second World War. For all my brilliance and logistical and tactical know-how, I was still a deeply flawed and tragic man in many ways, but my life should be remembered and studied, as the decisions I made shaped the history of the 20th century and thus the lives of everyone on planet Earth today.